Right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. If I haven't seen you yet. Okay. My name is Alban Gérôme. I work for Legal & General in London, and I work from home. And that's Legal & General is the biggest insurance company in the UK. So I've been working in analytics for about 12, 13 years, something like that now, mostly doing implementation. But I used to be a web analyst. I'm not a web analyst anymore now, although it says web analyst in my job title, but I'm really doing implementation. But the one of the main challenges I had as a web analyst was I was always wondering if it was just me, but it seems that the majority of web analysts are finding hard to have an impact in the companies they work for or the clients they work with. And I thought it was just me, but it seems to be that it's a generalized problem. And we're seeing the same thing with the data scientists as well. They find it very hard to make an impact. So I was wondering if maybe we work on a set of maybe incorrect assumptions. Maybe we have some illusions about how analytics is supposed to work and how stakeholders are supposed to react. And perhaps if we try to focus our analysis powers, if you like, more internally and see we can analyze better how stakeholders think and our clients as well. And maybe not just the clients and the customers, even customers who buy the products, maybe we could have more impact and maybe without giving so much effort. So I will try to, so you see here, you can see my mind map screen. So I don't know if you're familiar with what's a mind map. So I got a central idea about a better foundation for analytics, and there are different aspects of that which I'd like to talk about. I hope that I will have enough time to cover them all. But if not, I've made it public and I'll share the link via Twitter later. You might have to register with that software, Mind42, but it's free of charge to connect to that. So hopefully you'll be able to see the details. If I speak too fast, you should be able to go back to the mind map and see what's about. So, okay, I'll start with the first one. So the C-suite mandate. So what I call the C-suite mandate is basically how maybe not so much now, but when I started with web analytics, we had the impression as a web analyst that we were given some kind of carte blanche, or so the C-suite of a company had acquired new web analytics software or some analytics software of some sort, build a team, and as a web analyst, you were given access to a tool, and you were told to explore, find actionable insight, and then present your results. And then the C-suite will care about what you found. And usually I found that's not really what happens. The C-suite tends to be very hands-off, and they tend to tell the middle management and stakeholders to basically to work with a new analytics team. But the C-suite do not really care too much about becoming a data-informed organization themselves. They do want the organization to appear as if they care about becoming a data-informed organization, but they don't really do anything themselves. At best, they might hire a CDO, a chief data officer, so that they don't have to look into that. They have somebody dedicated to look into that. And very often, a CDO doesn't last very long in the companies. So that's the kind of problem we have. So C-suite that's very hands-off, and middle management tend to be think that maybe there's not so much into them, into becoming a data literate for them. They haven't seen or heard anybody that's ever been promoted anywhere for becoming a data champion. So they see that the C-suite don't really care so much about that. So they do a strict minimum that makes them look good or makes them data informed or working with a web analytics team. So the problem as a web analyst is that you can have a very sophisticated analysis and a lot of facts and data, a very strong logical argument to have something improved or changed or tried. But what happens if the stakeholders you try to convince are not very logical themselves, they make decisions at a more emotional level, then there's a good chance that all your hard work is all for nothing. It just falls on deaf ears. And then after time, you just think like, well, what am I doing here? I'm not having any impact. And then at the moment, there's a lot of demand for web analysts. So it would be very tempting for web analysts that has little impact in your organization to find another job somewhere else quite easily. So that brings another problem because the web analyst doesn't stay in companies very long, not long enough to build allies and networks internally and externally that could help them have more impact and have their voice better heard in the organizations, right? So yeah, so cover that. Yeah, the other result as well is that the stakeholders tend to be, they will be very encouraged to ask from web analysts a lot of data, a lot more than they need, just so that they can cherry pick the data that makes them look good. And the C-suite tolerates this, and at the end, nothing really changes. So the C-suite mandate is really about how maybe don't think that the C-suite is really supportive of web analytics. Actually, there was a KPMG survey of 2016 that revealed that only 51% of the C-suites that were surveyed fully supported the digital and analytics strategy of the organization. 51%, that's extremely low. So I suspect that a lot of them would rather have a top-down command and control model and then start with a gut. So the second point I'd like to talk about is data gaming. So by data gaming, I mean that a lot of companies and organizations will, like I was saying, will cherry pick the data that will support a specific agenda. So they would have made a decision beforehand, and they look for data that confirms what they want to push forward. So instead of going for starting with a business question and then let the analyst analyze the data and come up with recommendations, they have already decided what they want to recommend. I mean, the stakeholders, middle management, and the clients. So we have so what's called what I call the data justified practices instead of data driven or data informed decision making. And what we've seen in a couple of examples here that I have both these versus man and strategy measures, we have cases where data was falsified or cooked or cherry-picked. Bull versus Man is about a lawsuit about two climatologists in Canada that happened a couple of years ago and that have generated a lot of lawsuits. So Tim Bull was, well, still is a climatologist, a skeptic, so he doesn't believe that humans caused so global warming. And Michael Mann is exactly the opposite side. So he has built a model that proves exactly this. But what turned out was that Mann, the one who thinks that humans cause global warming, had built a model based on data that he did not want to share with anybody else, even though that was the project was publicly funded. And another group of statisticians have assembled to try to reverse engineer what model that Dr. Mann would have created. And they came to a conclusion that that model could not give a conclusive answer. It could actually prove either of those two people, Tim Bull, that the humans don't cause global warming, or Dr. Mann, that actually the opposite happens. So the only way that Dr. Mann could have come to a conclusion that humans cause global warming is that he has cherry-picked data, and that led to many lawsuits, defamation, all that. And Mann, the one who thinks that humans cause global warming, has lost all these lawsuits. So I'm not making a case for global warming was what's causing what, but that's a case of where, in that instance, that a climatologist has cherry-picked the data and it's been caught doing it. The second example of data gaming that I have here is about Tom Hendon. Tom Hendon was an economics student in the US, and as one of his assignments at university was to reproduce the findings of two Harvard Business School scholars. And those two scholars came up with the conclusion that it was about 10 years ago that governments should engage in adopt austerity measures to get out of a crisis. So the student could not reproduce the findings of those two scholars, so he contacted them directly, and they were gracious enough to share the Excel spreadsheet that the two scholars had worked from. And the student, Sir Tom Handon, there has found that they had the spreadsheet contained a lot of errors, and they had seemingly cherry-picked data again for no good reason. So he's confronted the two scholars, and they admitted that they had made errors in a spreadsheet, but they never changed their minds. They stick to the same conclusions. And the problem is that their paperwork, the paper of the two scholars never went through peer review, and it has even influenced a lot of policies, including in the UK, in the George Osborne government, which was about 2013, 2016, that period of time. So it seems that a lot of countries, and Greece as well, has been forced to engage in austerity measures based on an Excel spreadsheet that contains errors. Right. The other case of data gaming is an older example in history from 1902. So in 1902, in Hanoi, Vietnam, they had a case where they started recording cases of bubonic plague, and the bubonic plague, one of the main factors transmitting it is rats. So the health officials have announced that they will offer a bounty to people who will bring back the tail of a rat as evidence that they had killed a rat. So that worked very well, but after some time, some people started seeing some rats without a tail roaming in the streets of Hanoi. And then health officials found a rat farm outside of Hanoi. So people working there were farming rats to harvest the tails and pocket the bounty offered by the government. And that's an example of the Cobra effect, Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law means that once you pick a KPI, it stops becoming an effective measure because it gets gained. So the idea behind the data gaming is what gets measured gets managed. Yes, you can't manage what you can't measure, but also it could get gained very easily. So people will find ways to use that KPI to suit their own purposes. So can we say that the Hanoi case was a data-driven exercise? I would say yes, but it led to exactly the opposite effect than what the government wanted to achieve. So sometimes data-informed or data-driven is not always for good. So what I think companies should look into is having external companies to try to reproduce some data, what seemingly data-driven or data-informed initiatives in the companies to see if the data has not been gained or cherry-picked to push a certain agenda. And then what we should do next is if some culprits are found to have willfully manipulated data, they should also fire those people and even maybe take legal proceedings and then take them to court. In my view, it's almost no different than just stealing companies' money, really. So you make a company take strategic decisions based on wrong data and personal agendas. So the data should inform the decisions. And if we have auditors that can operate some kind of deterrence practice around the organization, it will force people to use data for good and use it well. And the vacancies left by those people who have been found out to cheat with data would create career opportunities and advancement opportunities for people who are true data champions in organizations. So I don't think that idea is very mature yet. I don't think other companies think about that way. They tend to tolerate data cherry picking and all sorts of irreproducible data recommendations. So the next branch I would like to talk about is how René Descartes, the philosopher, was wrong. So Descartes famously said, I think therefore I am. It sounds like neuroscientists think differently now. And one of them in particular, Antonio Damasio, a famous neuroscientist of Portuguese and American origin, studied a case where he found that, well, neuroscience knew for quite a while that the frontal lobe was a key part of the brain that's involved in decision making. So the frontal lobe sits just the front of the brain, so just above the two eyes, and it also so it controls emotions basically. So Dr. Damasio studied a case of patient Elliot. That's not his real name, but Elliot was one of his patients, and Elliot had a surgical procedure where they removed the frontal lobe of his brain because he had a brain tumor. And they found that in some cases, Elliot was more efficient at work, but he was also taking a lot of time to make decisions. It was always trying to ponder what's the best approach to do this or that, and sometimes, and quite often actually, he was giving his work late and he was not on time on his work, and he lost his job in the end. So he found also that Elliot could never make his mind about when would be the best time for the next appointment with Dr. Damasio. So that frontal lobe, without it, you can't all options are equal basically to you. So every option is the same. So it's very hard to make a decision when all options just look as good as one another. The second experiment of neuroscience that I found very interesting is the Iowa gambling task, and that should give a hard time to most webinars as well. So the Iowa gambling task consists of taking people to try to choose cards from 4 decks of cards. 2 decks provide very good outcomes, and 2 decks are very risky and make the participants lose money in the experiment. So the experiment has found that people express what's called galvanic skin response. Imagine connecting those people to something a bit like a lie detector, and they detect that the body of those participants emits a signal that suggests that those participants know which decks are good and which ones are risky, even before they're aware of it, consciously aware of it, I mean. So this experiment suggests that people actually have the gut feel is actually faster than becoming conscious of something. And they have also put through that experiment people who had a frontal lobe damage or removed, and they found that those people were unable to formulate any kind of winning strategy because although they acknowledge the fact that they had just made a loss or a win, to them that just meant the same thing. So they would come across as very impulsive as a result of that and play randomly. It's just because without the emotions, they can't make a decision, or rational one, at least they can't strategize. So if you think about that in a context of web analytics, that suggests that when we think that emotions play no role in emotions, in decision making, actually that might be wrong. Actually, we need to leverage emotions, and that helps with decision making. So having a purely logical argument does not always help. And the next point about irrationalities is referring to the fact that for a long time in economics, at least, we thought that people were making rational decisions, but it turns out that actually we're more predictably irrational, to use the title of a famous book by Dan Ariely, who has been very influential in that topic and demonstrating that that people actually are more irrational than we'd like to think. The next point is not so much about neuroscience, but more about psychology. So the Magic 7, you might have heard of how if you try to make people to remember something short term, they can only remember most of the time up to 7 items, plus or minus 2. So on average, 7 items in short-term memory. Usually 5 for people who struggle with this the most, and the most gifted people with short-term memory can remember up to 9 items in short-term memory. So that suggests that when you, as a web analyst, you try to use a lot of different facts, a lot of data to make your argument. Maybe there's a sweet spot you should aim for, and maybe not try to cram in as much information as possible that proves that your argument is solid, but try to go for fewer of those items so that it's easier for the stakeholders and the clients to try to convince that your argument is sound. And the last point here about emotions I'd like to make is that came to me as a bit of a comment I had a couple of weeks ago on LinkedIn on getting buy-in. Imagine that you try to set logs of wood. You have logs of wood and you want to make a fire out of them. And all you have to light your fire is just something that makes sparks or maybe a matchbox. And just those logs of wood. The fire will never really catch on. Your flame will just won't burn very, very fast. So what you need a bit of paper, right? When you start your fire, you set that bit of paper on fire, and you have a bit of more dry wood, small branches, and bits of light wood that can catch fire very quickly. And then if that sustains the heat, enough heat for a long enough time, if your logs of wood are dry enough, then you will reach the ignition point for those logs and those logs will burn. So if you take that metaphor and compare that tinder, so tinder is a thing that burns very quickly, to emotions. So you need those emotions to make a bigger fire, and the bigger fire, the logs of wood, would be the more logical side of your argument. So you need to use emotions to get the minds to ignite and understand the argument you're trying to make. So being conscious of time here, since I'm not, I'm watching my mind map and not the bigger screen. I don't know if I'm running out of time soon or not. Social intelligence, I'd like to make a case quickly about two famous physicians from the 19th century. So Louis Pasteur, being in France, you guys have heard of him, but you might not have never have heard of Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a physician in Austria. He was Hungarian. So what Semmelweis has found, he was working at a clinic, and he's found that the midwives' wards, so the nurses, female nurses, tended to wash their hands between patients, whereas the doctors' wards, they didn't. And there was a huge mortality rate difference between the two. And Semmelweis is the first one who has suggested that by washing their hands, they could reduce the mortality rate a great deal in that clinic. And at the time, doctors, male mostly, were very proud of their blood-stained aprons. But that was actually a breeding ground for bacteria that would be killing the patients, and we're taking those germs from one patient to the next. That's what's causing the high mortality rate with male doctors. And female nurses had a much better mortality rate, much lower one, because they were washing their hands. But when Ignaz Semmelweis tried to make that case, he was met with a lot of resistance, and he felt that his work should speak for itself. But he faced so much resistance that his boss fired him, and he died in a mental institution, completely insane. Probably due to a case of Alzheimer's or syphilis that brings dementia. Louis Pasteur, on the other hand, started about the same time as Semmelweis, by the way, different country. Louis Pasteur was studying how fruits can produce alcohol, so he studied fermentation basically. And from there, he progressively studied how bacteria can cause infections, disease, and lead to death. So because he was going more gradually in his process towards coming up with his theory about how bacteria can cause disease and death, he won a lot of allies along the way, and that's something that should bear in mind as a web analyst. Don't think that your work speaks for itself. You should try to win allies. Sometimes outside the company, inside the company, try to find case studies about other companies that try to do what you're recommending and tell how successful they were. That will have a lot of impact with the people who try to convince. The next one I would like to talk about is how stakeholders, clients, but everybody really has a need for autonomy and credit. Daniel Pink had a very good book called Drive, and also a great TED Talk, which I recommend you watch, about what drives motivation of people. And Dan Pink mentioned 3 factors drive motivation. So first, there will be a sense of purpose. So if you don't agree with the values of a company, it's very hard for you to be motivated by what you must do towards the values of a company and what they try to achieve. The second one would be autonomy. So people have a need to feel autonomous. They don't like to be micromanaged by their managers. They want to feel like they're autonomous in their work and they can make decisions for what works best in their work. And the third one would be the pursuit of mastery. So people, once they start studying something, they want to master that topic and become a recognized authority, a subject matter expert in that field. But one aspect of which is closely related to autonomy that I'd like to make here is the need for credit as well. So you could say that autonomy credit is probably the two sides of the same coin. So autonomy, what I mean is that as a web analyst, we perhaps tend to make polish recommendations, bring actionable insight to stakeholders, which is ready to implement. But when you do that, you deny them of any autonomy and you leave them no opportunity to claim any credit for implementing what you're recommending. So there was a famous experiment in the US in the 50s, Betty Crocker, that at the time, just after World War II, companies were starting producing washing machines and dishwashers to make the lives of housewives easier. And Betty Crocker was a food company, still is actually. They had the idea of making it easier for housewives to make cakes, to bake a cake at home in the oven. So they produced a cake mix. So it's like a pocket of powder that contains all the ingredients for you to bake a cake. You just have to add water, you mix it well, put that in a tin in the preheated oven. And then with that, you have a cake very easily in no time. But for some strange reason, that cake mix did not sell in the beginning. So Betty Crocker, they assembled a team of psychologists and a panel of customers. And they asked those customers, okay, what's wrong with the cake? Why don't you like it? And what do you like about it? So some of the customers said, well, the cake has a funny texture. And others said the cake sticks to the tins. So what really boils down to is that the clients would feel like they could get easily caught having baked a fake cake, so to say. So what they did is they found as well that the powdered eggs in the cake mix was causing the dodgy texture and causing the cake to stick to the tins. So they have removed the powdered eggs, they updated the package, and then they have they started selling a lot better after that because as wives, by adding an egg into the cake, they felt they had more emotional involvement with making the cake. So a bit later, what happens is those housewives are starting using the time they save baking the cake to get more credit for it by spending more time decorating it. So people have a need for autonomy, but have a need to claim credit as well. So as a web analyst, if you create recommendations that leave an opportunity for stakeholders to add a fresh egg of their own by choosing between different options, or like Leah Pikash, Leah Pikash is great about presentation skills. She speaks about how she leaves the customers to form their own conclusion. So she stops short of giving a final recommendation, but the clients tend to make the decision that she had planned for all along.
Alban,
so, yeah, 5 minutes.
we are going to need to wrap it up because it's 12:40.
Okay, so I'll skip the Pat Smith-Sinclair. You can watch that into the with a link I'll share a bit later. So the new start is that I think that we need to accept that the credit for making an organization more data-driven or more data-informed decisions should be shared across the organization. It's not for you as a web analyst to claim all that credit for yourself. You must learn to recognize that if you let the stakeholders give you a steer because they know the business and the domain knowledge, they can give you a good steer, ask a business questions, and it's up to you as a web analyst to analyze the data. But try to learn to blend in the logical side of your argument like you're doing now, but try to inject into that an emotional side to it so that you can appeal to more people. You have people who are more emotional than others, and you got some that appear more logical than others. So the bigger the group you are, the more balance you must try to strive for. And when people think that they need to understand your recommendations, what I think they really need behind that is a need to trust. So if we can actually aim for something that's tested rather than explainable, perhaps that will actually help people, so stakeholders and clients understand you better. And we should maybe focus less on the customer, but the end customer of the products, but perhaps, I think I've started the call, focus more that analysis on trying to convince the stakeholders who will implement the recommendations that we're making. And by doing that, they have more emotional involvement, and it's a lot harder to back out from something that you have been dealing with. It's called the IKEA effect, really. So